Hello, my name is Julian Wells. I'm a veterinary surgeon with a background in small animal practice, followed by a period in industry. I'm one of 6 vets appointed to oversee the completion of the professional development phase, or PDP as it's known. The UK veterinary schools are tasked with providing all veterinary graduates with a broad selection of what are called day 1 skills. These are divided into, firstly, general professional skills such as communication, secondly, the underpinning science, and finally, basic practical competence. The PDP is a period of initial employment when graduates are evolving their practical competence to become safe and effective clinicians, otherwise referred to as Year 1 competent. Competence is defined as the ability to complete a procedure within a reasonable period of time with minimal supervision and a high probability of a successful outcome. The PDP is a simple web-based record allowing self-assessment of progress and providing a structure to early career development that is both reassuring for the individual and easily adapted into graduate development programs, appraisal systems, and in-practice mentoring. A list of competencies grouped into systems has been developed in conjunction with the various professional representative bodies, such as the BVA, BSAVA, BEVA, and so on. These provide an aid memoir for tracking progress and identifying gaps in practical experience. Continuing professional development, CPD, is a professional obligation for most, if not all, regulated professions. It represents rungs on a ladder of lifelong learning and provides public confidence in the profession. The PDP is the second rung following graduation and is itself a professional obligation for both the graduate and, very importantly, for the employer. However, a vital element of the PDP is support for the graduate. Primarily, that support should be provided by senior members of practice staff. But you also have access to one of the 6 of us. When registering to begin the PDP record, each graduate is allocated a dean who will be in contact by email to introduce themselves and provide initial outline guidance. We can be contacted, preferably by email, for help or support at any time. We will also keep an eye on your PDP progress and liaise with the RCVS Education Department, eventually issuing a declaration form for completion and submission. So that's a general background to what we're going to be talking about today. Let me now hand over to my colleague Mary to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Mary Thompson. I've been working with PDP as a postgraduate dean since 2014. I've spent most of the last 20 years working as a vet in first opinion practice and also in government animal health and more recently in education. First of all, I'm going to talk you through how to log into the PDP system and get access to your skills log to begin recording. So when you first want to register for PDP, you need to log in to the RCVS PDR website and register your details. You will need to send an email to pdp@rcvs.org.uk. In that email, we need you to provide your full name, your RCVS reference number, where and when you graduated, an address for correspondence about your PDP, the name and address of your workplace or practice, the email address that you want to use with your PDP PDR system. Now, this must be an email address which is personal to you and not, for example, a shared practice mailbox. You will also need to provide us with the name and email address of the person who will be looking after your PDP. This person will be your mentor in practice and could be your boss or perhaps another senior veterinary colleague. I'm going to demonstrate how to log in to your PDP skills log when you begin recording for the first time. So you can see that I'm on the RCVS PDR website. I'm going to go to this section and enter my username and then my password, and then click the login button. When you first log in, you will see at the moment that I'm viewing a CPD. You need to click on PDP to view your PDP. As we move across the tabs at the top here, you've got your Add Experience tab, which Julian mentioned during the presentation. You click on that to add your skills. You've got your PDP Skills Log tab, which is where you can view the skills that you've recorded so far. You can see here that you've got your species groups, your confidence settings. So as you progress, you move from not confident through to confident. You've got your notes section. We've got some example notes in this test system. Your contact section. So when your PDP Dean contacts you for the first time, you will receive a SkillWise alert to your email address, but you can also view all your previous contacts with your PDP Dean in this contact section. There's a section about the PDP. And in the presentation, we mentioned about the Year 1 competencies and the list of skills and attributes that you're expected to have on completion. That's where you can find that information within your skills log. And I would just stress again that when you want to record your PDP skill numbers and your notes, you want to go to this Add Experience tab and then click to update your numbers and your recorded reflective notes. If you go to this tab here, you're just viewing an overview. Up here, you can go in to edit your personal details. Now I have some questions for Julian about the process of PDP recording. The first question, Julian, is must you add notes for every competence?
No, not necessarily. Some procedures or clinical cases will involve a number of skills from the list, and a single reflective note might cover several skills or even an entire group. The sections on the PDP listing are divided systemically, and sometimes a single detailed note will cover most, if not all, of the skills listed in one particular section.
Okay. Could you tell me now, please, do participants need to submit case studies? And if so, how many or what type of cases? And are there a set number of times that participants are expected to have done each skill listed?
Well, I'll start with the last bit of the question, if I may. The lists of skills are there very much as an aide memoire as to what's likely to be covered during that initial period of building competence. The number of repeats are completely irrelevant. They're there to help to remind you where you've got to, but once you feel that you're competent in a particular skill, there's absolutely no need to keep on logging extra numbers. We're not really interested in whether you've done 1 vaccine, 500 vaccines, or 2,000 vaccines. What's important is that you feel competent in going through the process with the client. So once you've done enough to feel that you're competent, just add a note to the effect that you've done so, and that's fine. Case studies, that section allows you to record interesting cases for future reference and or use the records to reference skills and provide reflections. Generally speaking, graduates tend to write reflective notes rather than try to incorporate everything into a case study, but you are welcome to do either. If using case studies to include your reflections, then it is quite useful for us as deans to have a little note to that effect in the notes section, so that we're not looking for notes that don't exist and we're just signposted to the case study in question.
And when we're writing reflective notes as graduates completing PDP, is there an expectation that we reflect on everything or just the things that we think are important?
It's not necessary to cover every single competence on the list with a reflective note. I've just used the example of vaccination. I think most people in small animal practice, for instance, would be very familiar very quickly with the routine of vaccination. Perhaps the reflection would be on the opportunity to build a relationship with the client and develop that as a practice building tool, rather than necessarily on the clinical procedure. Reflections are a very important part of contemporary professional development in all walks of life. And our assessment of the completion of the PDP record is largely based on reading how your development has continued, either in the notes or in the case studies. There are no set rules as to how many skills you're going to mention in one particular reflective note. But it is necessary to cover each section and to provide us with a bit of reflection on all sections of the PDP listing.
Thank you. And I think actually that answer has covered the next question that we had from graduates as well, which was around the difference between a case report and a reflective note. Was there anything else that you felt you wanted to add there, Julian, about the difference between case reports and reflections?
Well, I would just say that case reports tend to be clinical notes and observations, whereas reflections are all about what you learned, how you overcame issues, how you would approach a similar case in the future. Most of our graduates tend to write notes, reflective notes, rather than using the case studies. But it's really up to you. Either is fine as far as we're concerned.
Okay, thanks. And there's a section within PDP where graduates are expected to set their confidence levels. Could you just briefly describe, Julian, please, how they do that?
Yes, by all means. When you go into the tab that is labeled Add Experience, that's the tab that you use to add numbers to the competence boxes and also to access the note part of the system. There's also a series of drop-down boxes in each major section that allow you to continually update your confidence in that particular section. So obviously you start off on day one not feeling very confident about any of it, and gradually as you become more competent, your confidence will improve. And we would generally expect that a graduate coming up to completion would feel confident, fully confident in most of the sections.
And I think as PDP deans, there are some questions that come up again and again, and some challenges that PDP participants will communicate with us regularly on. And I've got a few questions around that now, Julian. So what if the company that the graduate is working for doesn't have a case to complete a particular portion of their PDP?
Yes, we don't expect every graduate to have covered every skill on the list. It's quite a comprehensive list in each of the clinical disciplines, companion animal, farm animal, and equine. Inevitably, some practices won't provide equipment, say for instance, an endoscope. And so that particular skill might not be something that you're able to experience. What we would like to see is a note to just indicate how you would deal with a case that required that particular procedure to be carried out. So perhaps how you would consult with other members of the practice, whether or not you would refer the case, what the procedure would be to do so.
And that's providing comment on those wider professional skills, which are so important as part of development as well. Some PDP participants have reported that when they've added skills to their list, they've then gone back to their PDP record and the skills had not been saved. Could you explain why that is, please?
Yes, this seems to be a common technical issue. It's very important that when you're adding your skills, you go in through the Add Experience tab rather than just simply look at the list of skills that you've applied. There is another tab that allows you just to look at the list of skills. If you go into that one, you can change the numbers, but they don't save.
Is it acceptable for PDP participants to write case records up and then copy them into their PDP skills log?
Yes, it's possible to copy and paste into the log. There is a limit on the number of characters that can be copied across, but it's quite a generous limit. And once you've gone through the procedure once, it's a very simple procedure to repeat and follow. So Mary, on to a few questions for you. What type of things are logged on the PDP, and is it operations or clinical skills in general?
We've already talked in Julian's section about case reports and reflective notes. As Deans, we are looking for reflective notes which provide evidence of how your skills are developing. These notes could be on medical cases that you've managed, operations that you've carried out, and also on wider professional skills such as client communication, certification, herd health planning in farm practice, and also biosecurity or infection control. There are examples of reflective notes on the RCVS website, and your PDP Dean will be happy to review your notes at any time, and your PDP Dean and your mentor in practice will both be able to provide feedback on where there might be areas for development and areas where you might want to add or expand on your PDP notes.
And do we need to keep recording numbers for things that we do regularly, for instance, blood sampling?
It wouldn't be practical for us to expect PDP participants to record every single skill. That would become too onerous and too much of a tick box exercise. What we are looking for is estimated skills numbers, and in recording those estimated skills numbers, that's helping your mentor in practice and your PDP Dean to identify where there might be gaps and where you might need to take action in the workplace to perhaps adjust rotas to allow better case exposure. So we recommend normally that you set aside the equivalent of around 15 minutes per week to do your PDP recording and to update your estimated skills numbers. Once you're confident with a particular skill, you can stop recording numbers in that section and make a note explaining that you feel confident with that skill.
So the numbers don't have to be absolutely accurate?
No, that's correct. You can estimate your skills numbers. If you're recording at the end of the week, you can think back on your week and estimate how many vaccination or blood sampling appointments you have seen in that week.
Okay, so when should you log a case versus just adding a total of skills?
So there's no set requirement on the approach that you take to recording case reports versus reflective notes. You can choose whether you record a range of reflective notes, some case reports, and you might want to do that, as Julian's already mentioned, for a particularly challenging or interesting case, or you could use a combination of both approaches, providing that signposting in your notes around whether you've recorded a case or a reflective note for that section. For the case reports, it's really important that you include your reflective comments within that case and make reference to the specific skills that you developed when you were managing that case.
And what about duplicate cases? I suppose there's some times when a graduate will feel that they're improving in one particular area, should they then keep on recording both skills and notes to indicate that sort of process of improvement?
Yes, I think if there's an area where you're still developing your skills, it can be really helpful to record a series of notes. So we're not saying that you have to record that series of progressive notes for every skill, but if you found a case particularly challenging, so for example, if in the initial period in practice you were finding bitch space quite daunting, you might record a note at that point stating that you had requested some support from a senior colleague or a scrubbed assistant. And then 3 or 4 months down the line, you might record an updated note describing how you've developed your skills, adapted your techniques, and increased your confidence. I think that's when you can really use that series of 2 or 3 reflective notes to highlight your progression over a period of time. You might also decide to record a series of several notes reflecting on your progress for skills areas, again, where you and your mentor or your PDP dean have agreed that you need to focus. So now, Julian, I have some questions for you regarding recording PDP skills. So could you tell us what supporting evidence should be uploaded and how many skills should be recorded?
Well, first of all, we're looking for a broad range of skills to be recorded, and a set of reflective notes that cover each section of the PDP. We don't require supportive evidence as such in the way of specific reports, evidence or whatever. What is important, though, as we've already mentioned a couple of times, is that there are reflections on your learning. It would be very much just a tick box exercise, this, if we were only relying on numbers of skills being repeated in the boxes on the list. The reflective notes really are the thing that we assess the PDP process on. So no need for structured supportive evidence, but lots of reflective notes.
Thanks, Julian. And is there a need to reflect on every single skill, and for each clinical skill or submission, do you write a full case report or describe how you did that skill?
A brief clinical description can be helpful, but the really important thing is thinking about what you've learned from repeating that particular procedure. What went well, what went badly, how you may approach the case differently in future, where you would go for help if the procedure wasn't going according to plan, and when you would consider referral if it was a particularly complicated procedure or where an unexpected complication had arisen that you didn't feel competent to deal with. So although a brief description of the clinical procedure is fine, simply recording that you've done it or that this is the way you did it is not really sufficient. We do need a bit more about the, as I say, reflecting on how things went. As you cover each individual skill, you can write brief notes on each one. And it's quite helpful if there is a continual development of the PDP record as you develop your competence and confidence. So if you're reporting on individual skills, it would be quite a brief note and there'd be quite a lot of them. Whereas if you're reflecting on a group of skills or an entire section, particularly if you're applying notes retrospectively, then we would expect a much more detailed note that covered a number of skills or sections at a time.
That's great. And I think that really covers the next question as well, which was around how many notes does each point need? I think what we're saying there is that we're not looking for a set number of notes. It depends on the length of the note and whether you've taken an approach of each skill or a group of skills together within one reflective note.
Absolutely.
Thank you. There was then a question around the style of notes, so what style of notes, what way do they need to be written for the sections, and how much do PDP participants need to write in their notes?
Well, we have several hundred graduates on each of our lists, and to read a huge long essay on every occasion that we're reading a portfolio would obviously be very cumbersome. We're looking for concise notes. They should summarize the performance of the various skills. Bear in mind the definition of competence that we mentioned earlier, because that's what you're trying to achieve. We assess your progress based on those notes. So basically, they should be just telling in a concise way the story of your development from day one to year one competence, reflecting on learning outcomes, and where relevant, telling us how you would deal with challenging cases, particularly challenging cases in the future. So, Mary, your turn to answer a few questions now. Do you have to complete all of the skills at least once to have your PDP signed off? And how do you sign off skills?
The PDP skills list is quite extensive, and I think quite often graduates get concerned that they're not gaining experience of every single skill. So just to provide that reassurance that we're not looking for you to complete every skill. I think, for example, in small animal practice, you might not have the opportunity to carry out a vasectomy as part of the surgery section. That's okay. When we review your PDP skills log, we're considering transferable skills. And if you're in any doubt about this, my advice would be to contact your PDP dean to ask about your skills development and to get their view to add to the opinion of your mentor in practice about your progress with your PDP. Regarding signing off PDP skills, you need to be working with your mentor in practice regularly to make sure that they're happy with your progress and that you're working towards meeting the PDP completion requirements. When you and your mentor in practice agree that you're close to completing your PDP, I advise that you contact your dean and ask for a review regarding any skills areas where you might not have recorded so many numbers, and then when you're ready, we would ask you to change your PDP status to apply for completion.
Thank you. I think we may have covered some of this before, but what if there are areas that the practice doesn't do? For example, post-mortems, how do we get to sign those off? And what about if the practice doesn't have particular types of equipment?
Yes, again, this is a question that comes up quite regularly when we're in contact with recent graduates who are completing their PDP. And I would just provide reassurance and say, don't worry, we realise that not all workplaces will have a full range of equipment available, particularly if you work in a practice that has a main surgery and then satellite branches. So if you can let your PDP dean know if you have limited access to, for example, an endoscope, and my advice would be that you could record a note about a case that you would refer, for example, for endoscopy, or if you had a situation where you had a need to refer a case for an independent post-mortem exam, you could make a note to that effect. The key thing is that you let us know, but you will still be able to complete your PDP even if you do not have access to some specialist pieces of equipment.
Oh, thank you. And is there somewhere where one can see a list of the skills that are expected to be covered by the end of this first year?
Yes, there's obviously you've got your skills log itself where you've got the various skills that you're recording, but there is also a list of the PDP competencies, and that's available in the PDP information section of the RCVS website. Your mentor in practice will be signposted to that information when you first sign up to your PDP as well.
Oh, that's helpful, thank you. And what about the ratio of practical to theory? COVID this year has made life and practice very complicated, and we may not have seen sufficient skills to warrant signing off in the period that we're expected to. How do we handle that?
We realise that COVID this year has provided some enormous challenges for veterinary practices, and again, the key thing is to keep in contact with your PDP dean. So if, for example, you had been furloughed and your practical skills development has been impacted by COVID restrictions, or if your practice has been seeing a reduced caseload for routine cases, you can contact your PDP dean and we can make arrangements for you to extend your PDP recording period. PDP participants have up to 3 years to complete their PDP. So it may be that you don't need to request an extension, but we would just provide that reassurance that we can extend your recording period should you need us to do that. And that applies to COVID, but it also applies to other situations that you might find yourself in as well. If you're having difficulties for some reason that are limiting your ability to complete your PDP, the key thing is to keep in contact with us and we can provide you with the right support.
Well, thank you. We've had a number of inquiries from overseas graduates, and they may be coming to work in the UK or considering coming to work in the UK, and they've heard that they need to do a thing called a PDP, which might not be terribly familiar to them. First question: I've worked abroad for several years before coming to the UK, and starting my PDP record. Can I apply skills retrospectively?
The answer is that yes, you can apply skills retrospectively. When an overseas graduate registers with RCVS, that graduate is asked to complete the overseas declaration form, and the statement that they select on that form determines whether there's a need to complete the PDP. So any postgraduate experience that has already been gained overseas can be recorded in your reflective notes and estimated skills numbers in your skill recording section. So in answer to this question, if you develop those skills while working in France, it is fine to record them, and then your current mentor in your workplace will be required to sign to confirm that you meet the requirements of PDP when you are completing your declaration on completion of the skills recording process.
And supposing I've qualified in the UK and gone overseas immediately to work in another country, do I have to do the PDP in the other country?
If you've gone overseas straight away, PDP is not mandatory. Although what I would say is that you should keep in mind that if you plan to return to the UK, you might then be asked to complete your PDP, depending on what you're entering in that declaration that we mentioned already. Whilst it's not mandatory to complete PDP while abroad, you are able to complete the process if you wish to. PDP usually requires an MRCVS colleague or mentor to countersign your completion declaration. One of the challenges that is sometimes faced by participants working overseas is that they may not be working alongside a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. Again, this is a situation where you should keep in touch with your postgraduate dean. It is possible for a non-MRCVS colleague to sign off for a vet working overseas, as long as that colleague is registered with their appropriate regulator. So again, the key thing there is that you keep in touch with your PDP dean and inform them if you do not have an MRCVS mentor.
In other countries, this sort of PDP system is not available. Is there an online version that overseas graduates can log into from abroad?
So if you are working overseas and you've decided that you wish to complete PDP, you will be able to access your RCVS PDR skills log in the same way as a graduate based in the UK. You'll receive support in the same way that a graduate in the UK would. And when you first register, you will receive a welcome email with instructions from your PDP dean. Again, as we mentioned before, there is also information available in the PDP section of the RCVS website. If you feel you need additional support at any time, or you're feeling unsure about how to complete your PDP, you can contact your PDP Dean and request a review of your notes and progress to find out how you're doing and where you maybe need to add more to your skills log.
And what about searching for jobs? Am I able to get a job before I start doing the PDP?
You need to be in a job to complete your PDP, so the whole process of PDP is supporting you in transition to the workplace. So you've found your first job in practice, whether that's in the UK or overseas, and then you're signing up to your PDP to support that transition period, as you described, Julian, during your introduction.
Well, thank you. And final question from overseas: how and where can we find practices that have mentors for the PDP?
All employers of new and recent graduates should be able and have the capability to provide appropriate support and mentoring for PDP participants. One of the things that we advise is that when you are applying for jobs and attending interviews, that is a question you ask at interview. So bring up the subject of PDP, ask what type of support you will get, how often you'll have review meetings, and perhaps even try and find out who your mentor in practice would be. One of the things that you could consider, particularly if you were moving to the UK from overseas and looking for practices where you might apply for jobs, you could consider looking at practices that are registered with the RCVS Practice Standards Scheme, as that is a scheme which ensures that there is appropriate support in place, not just for new and recent graduates, but for other staff team members as well. So that's brought us to the end of our PDP questions today. I'm now going to hand over to David Charles, who has recently completed his PDP and can provide some top tips from a graduate's perspective.
Hi, I'm Dave. I qualified from Bristol summer of 2019 and I finished my PDP sort of late summer 2020, so after about a year in practice. So just a few sort of tips, some of the sort of things that I found and some of the things that people told me when I started, which then were quite useful when I was going through the PDP as well. So, the first one is, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So the best way really to make the most out of PDP is to do little and often. So I found I did mixed practice first, and then I moved into farm practice, and I'd do a little bit every weeknight when I was on call. Kind of if you're on call, you're kind of working anyway. So, spending half an hour or so updating your PDP for what you've done that week, A, makes it more manageable, and B, it doesn't feel like you're giving up loads of your own free time to do it. So that's quite a nice way of doing it. And it stops it becoming this mammoth thing if you're just doing it week by week. The next thing really is that obviously PDP is for you. They're your notes to help you sort of reflect and track your own progress. It doesn't really matter what other people that you graduated with are doing or how they're finding it. Very much, make notes that make sense to you and help you reflect and learn on how much you're progressing in that first year, because you're definitely going to be coming on an awful lot. Similarly linked to that, it's a really good way of actually seeing how far you've come as well. So, if there are points in time where you're struggling a bit and you think you're maybe not progressing or you're finding things hard, actually having a flick back through your PDP notes, there'll be some good tips in there that you've written yourself that you'll find really going to give you some advice and help. But also you'll be able to see, if you look at those early entries from quite soon after you qualified, you'll be able to see how much more you're able to do now, how far you've come on and how much your confidence has developed. And then lastly as well, for sort of bigger procedures, so big ops like cesareans or DAs or spays and stuff on the small animal side, I tried to sort of, for everyone, reflect on a few notes about what went well. So try and pick 2 or 3 things that went well and comment on those, and then also pick 1 or 2 things that you want to focus on more the next time you do one. So then when you go and do that next one, you kind of have some objectives already, and also then it links into making it really quite rewarding reflection as well, because you can see over time the things you want to work on next will then become this went really well. The nice thing about starting out in practice is hopefully you're in a nice supportive practice, and you've got experienced colleagues who are going to sort of mentor you and, you know, scrub in with you on ops or talk through cases with you. And that's the other really nice thing about PDP is you can compare what you've learned from different vets that you work with, different colleagues, and actually, you know, your consulting style or your surgical style will be a mix of what you've seen on EMS and what your colleagues do when you start out as well. And you very much find your own style, and being able to reflect back on your PDP and being like, oh, I liked the way that I stitched up with this colleague, but then I preferred the way that this colleague sort of laid out their kit and how their sort of surgical approach. That is all really useful stuff that the PDP really helps, and it makes it a lot more rewarding and a lot easier to do as well if you can see how it's helping you when you're going forwards. But obviously, I know PDP can be a bit challenging as well. And for me, the biggest thing I found with PDP was the hardest part was getting started and knowing what to write for those first few entries. And then obviously, you know, like I've touched on, once you've done a few, it's a lot easier to then reflect and track your progress. But for those first ones, you know, just simple things like reflect on skills that maybe you felt you couldn't do that well when you were at university, and look at how you're progressing with those. And also, you know, common things are common, those sort of routine things as well. How's your confidence in just your client communication, opening your consults, doing blood samples, vaccines and stuff? That's a really good place to start. And then as you build your clinical competence and you get to do more day to day, then you've got more to reflect on and more to note down on your PDP. And, you know, have a good read through some of the older entries every other month or so, and then you can really see how far you've come, and it'll make it a lot more rewarding. And then you'll kind of know when you're ready to sign it off as well. And then, you know, it makes for a nice sort of review meeting with your boss or your line manager as well to go through some of the PDP, and you can both acknowledge quite how far you've come and how much you've progressed as a vet already. So PDP is quite rewarding.
So just to sum up how to get help, by all means email your dean. We're always happy to hear from you, and we're looking at the PDP records all the time, familiar with them. If you need some assistance, get in touch with us. Look at the RCVS website, where there are a number of resources to guide you through the process of completing the PDP. Professional organisations such as the BSAVA have resources on their website specifically to support new graduates, so it's worth having a look there. The guidance notes that you can access from the PDP site are fully comprehensive and run you through the whole process. And the PDP staff in the education department at the RCVS will always be happy to answer either practical or particularly technical questions. So never feel that you're on your own. We're here to help. By all means, get in touch with us.